Hello everybody, we are here with EU League caster Gio Collins to recap the EU Major that just happened. First question, of course, how are you doing, Gio?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing really well, hoping that it doesn't rainstorm here. But we just wrapped up the EU League Major, and BDS are champions. When you were going into the event, did you have a winner in mind? Did you think there was a favorite that was going to take it all?
I did, and it's kind of embarrassing to admit now because I thought Rogue was going to win the whole thing. Ended up being the first team to go out, so I'm never predicting anything ever again.
I don't know if you can just never make predictions again, but I feel that.
No, I'm never predicting anything ever again.
So you're off the Rogue train as well.
Well, I don't know about that yet. I just think a lot of people had hope that it wasn't just a LAN problem, or it was just a LAN problem, and that in an online event they'd be fine. And now everyone's thinking, actually, no, it's probably just an event problem. So I don't know if I'm totally off the Rogue train, but I'm certainly a lot more doubtful than I was before.
Rogue have had some issues with consistency when it comes to big events, and heading into this event in particular, there seemed to be an awful lot of expectations, not just on their shoulders, but on the shoulders of the other three teams as well. For you, from a talent perspective, what expectations do you think were met during the Major and which ones weren't?
Well, I mean, the easier part to answer to that is what expectations weren't met, and that is there are three players really I can kind of put that down to, and that's Aces, Leon, and Kajeka, all three of whom did really well throughout Stage 1, and even if you look back to something like Pro League Season 11, Aces, for example, was so strong, so good, constantly, he was at the top of the leaderboard for a number of stats. And these are just three players who didn't show up that well, particularly Aces. There were a number of times where there were moments where you think, oh, this is an Aces moment, he can take this. And he just wouldn't. And it was kind of strange. You know, there were moments of brilliance. There were moments of greatness where you saw what these players had to offer. And those were the moments where it's like, yes, that's what I expected from this team. But I think the inconsistency that you mentioned is the really big part of that. Because it was like, okay, we had these positive expectations for Rogue, and they could only show them sometimes.
What about the other three teams? Obviously, BDS wins. It's a pretty wild final between them and G2. VP doesn't really show up as strong as some people had expected. What were your thoughts on those three teams heading in? I mean, you said that you thought Rogue was going to take it, but how did you think the other results were going to shake out?
Okay, well, Virtus Pro I found really interesting because they only got into the event on a technicality, really, because Na'Vi kind of messed up at the last hurdle. They had a really interesting run in Stage 1 of the EU League because they came in really on fire off the back of the European Open Clash, which they won. Then they kind of fell flat on their face, and they had to build themselves up one player at a time, it really seemed, as they were going in through the 5 weeks of the stage. And the big question for me was, okay, they've had all this time, are they going to be able to mesh it all together and see that coming to fruition in the event? And the answer was yes, especially when you look at a player like Mission. He was someone who I had really big expectations for because he was the last player on VP who really picked himself up. He was such a major part of their entire strategy in the past and their playstyle. They like to play this really objective playstyle based around him, and that was something that they ended up doing exceptionally well in this event, even if they didn't get all the way through to the finals. When you look at someone like G2, I think what we really expected from them was insane firepower. Of course, I think it's fair to say that since the SI 2019 victory that they had, this is probably the best roster, or the scariest roster that they've had. And so seeing that just really light up was obviously fantastic. But there was a lot of great examples of really good coordination come from them. That's something we really wanted to see, because even though they had a good run in the first stage of the EU League, they did come across a couple of hurdles in the form of draws, which I know they weren't very happy about, and they knew that they had more to give off the back of that. As for BDS, well, I mean, we knew that BDS had done very well in Stage 1 of EU League, but they started to drop off towards the end of the stage. One of the really big games that gave us question marks was the game they played against Team Empire, where they lost 7-1, and it seemed really out of character for them, and a lot of us wondered, is this just them starting to go downhill, or are they taking, their foot off of the gas a little bit just because they don't need to be anymore? Well, obviously, it turned out that it wasn't an inherent problem. tournament. It wasn't something overall to be worried about. But what we did see that was great from them, that was maybe a bit unexpected, was who was showing up the most on that team. Obviously, Renshiro got MVP, and quite rightly too. He got the highest cost, he got the highest rating of every player in the tournament. But then you look at someone like Shaiko, who had shown up so much in Season 11 of Pro League, but had a much quieter time in the EU League, and he was just unstoppable. And then someone like Bride, who had been unstoppable in EU League, was a bit quieter in this event. So I think some of the expectations there shifted in terms of who showed up on BDS, but the fact they showed up at all very much met expectation.
For BDS, obviously their victory is extremely significant for themselves. It's the first time that a French team has won an international tourney since, I would go all the way back to say, was it Millennium back in DreamHack Austin, even if you consider that an international tournament. What do you think BDS's win means for the landscape of Europe? You mentioned Bride, you mentioned Renshiro showing up. Do you think that this is a team that is finally the real deal, or do you see the major being a blip or an outlier?
I think it'd be unfair to say it's a blip or an outlier, especially given the fact that they came fourth at SI this year. So this obviously isn't a team who just came in, had a random fluke of a good tournament and are going to disappear into the ether again. That's evidently not going to be the case. I think what's really meaningful about it is that over the last couple of years, we've seen the competition in Europe become a lot tighter. You know, it's very hard to be like, this is the best team in the region, or this is the best team in the region. Obviously, Rogue have been top of the leaderboard for a while. You've also got teams like G2, who are just this super team we talk about. BDS have now won this tournament. It makes it so much harder to predict what's going to happen, and I think it sends quite a hot breath down the necks of teams like G2, who are looking for that redemption arc, narrowly missed out on it this time, and now they've got to worry about this new big rival. You've also got teams like Na'Vi, who have obviously recently made huge changes to their roster, who they are also looking for their own redemption arc after not finding much success after the Tokoname win. So it's certainly going to make competition seem a lot harder, and once true international competition returns after, you know, the pandemic goes away, I think it's going to make it so much more difficult to predict who is going to be representing Europe, who is really going to show up in Europe. And it's also going to make it so much harder for the teams that don't, because it doesn't necessarily mean they don't deserve it or they're not good enough. And I think that's an exciting thing as a spectator and as a caster, but as a player, it's probably a bit more daunting.
When you talk about how competition continues to rise in Europe, this is something that we hear in most other regions. Now, Europe for a long period of time was indisputably the best team, or the best region rather, with the best teams in all of Rainbow Six. Doesn't really seem to be the case anymore. So having watched the other regions, how do you feel that EU stacks up, especially after seeing the 4 teams collide in the EU major?
I understand this could be a contentious point, because obviously it's an NA caster versus an EU caster on this, but actually I kind of agree with you. I think that the general consensus right now is that NA is probably the strongest region. I don't think it's necessarily that the players or the teams in NA are decidedly better than those in EU, but I think there is a more distinct playstyle between the two regions, in that NA is very much more objective focused, it's very methodical, whereas EU's taken a bit more of a step towards the aggressive. And I think going up against each other, EU might have a bit of a problem, purely from the perspective of the fact that you still have good gunners on NA. NA can be aggressive when they want to, and if they have both of those factors, and EU have been focusing a lot more on one of them, then obviously you can see where the scales would tip. As for APAC's going to be a bit different, because they're even further down the aggressive side of the spectrum. And then, I mean, LATAM is is in its own bubble in that, right? So I think I would probably say that NA is the more prepared region right now, and arguably the strongest region, but I don't think there's much in it.
I think it'll be fascinating when we do get back to LAN events, because these teams are going to find that as we spend more time just scrimming inter-regional, the metas are going to really solidify, and there's going to be very limited crossover, and it's something that players have talked about in the past, is that there's kind of a soft reset every LAN, because the teams then get to see and experiment with other playstyles, and then they can export that back to their regions, you know, or import it depending on what side of the coin that you're on. Pivoting off of the EU major though, there was a bit of an interesting dust-up on Twitter a couple days ago involving you and a very widely shared clip regarding toxicity online. And it's a clip that involves you playing on Cafe, you get team killed, you make a comment on stream about how it was pertaining to the fact that, you know, the players were being sexist, they level sexist insults at you. What's your experience been so far with Rainbow Six as you've been playing this game either on stream or off stream, and how does it stack up to the other games that you play in terms of toxicity?
I would say that I always find it difficult to talk about this topic because I've heard a lot of stories from a lot of girls about their experiences and they've never fully aligned with mine. As a general rule, I have not found that to be a huge problem in any game that I play. I've never been the sort of person who stops using comms or anything, so I think generally it's like if I feel I'm adding value to a team, oftentimes I won't get flack from people. And for me, usually it's less about toxicity and it's more like, oh, I enter voice comms and this guy goes, are you a girl? And it's like, yeah, can we move on? Less so than actual toxicity. In that clip, obviously, yeah, not great, it happens, and I kind of just put it on Twitter because it was annoying. I didn't really expect that clip to go anywhere. But as a general rule, it sounds like a really boring answer, but I haven't really in general. I think much less than a lot of other women who I've spoken to.
I find it funny because this topic does often pop up, and I saw the fury that came to your tweet in particular with people trying to hand wave away the issue, and I can't imagine what that's like to deal with, because it's a perspective that I don't have. But
well, it's just the frustrating thing about it is anyone who knows me knows I'm the last person on earth who will try to turn something into like a sexism issue if I don't genuinely feel like it is. So when there are certain people who are like, this is not about gender, and I'm like, the dude called me a dishwasher, man. Like, what is it about? Like, I'm not gonna like unnecessarily politicize certain things. So it's kind of annoying because it's like if I say that that's what it was about, the chances are that's what it was about. Like, I don't need you and your 30 followers in my mentions trying to tell me otherwise.
Now, you made the shift over to Rainbow Six, coming from a wide variety of casting. What do you find the most different and the most challenging about Rainbow Six, aside from learning the game? Is there anything unique to Rainbow Six that you didn't experience?
I think the big thing, and I think you as a caster will understand this, or maybe have thought about this a bit more than sort of the general audience, but the big thing is casting Siege stylistically is very different to casting something like Overwatch. In Overwatch, there are very distinct roles in a cast. You obviously have your play-by-play and your color caster, which still exists in Siege, but it's a lot more of a looser boundary. And so veering into doing any kind of hype stuff was not something I had a lot of experience in, and in Siege you have to be able to do both regardless of what role you primarily take on, and that's kind of, it felt alien to me. You know, I knew it was going to be a challenge because it wasn't something that I was used to, and it wasn't something that I necessarily felt came super naturally to me. I think most casters feel like they fall one way or the other in terms of where their natural style is, but that's definitely been a big learning curve for me. But other than actually learning things about the game, I mean, I was already part of the community. I already loved watching Siege Esports. I already knew people in the community, so I didn't necessarily feel like the new kid in school who has just shown up without knowing who anyone was or having to learn all the players or anything like that. I definitely felt comfortable with those things. It's just, you know, the game's hard, man, and it's a learning curve.
You've spoken in the past about studying your casting and going over and trying to make improvements and all of that. With a new game where you're still trying to learn the game, is there anything that you do different when you go back and you rewatch your VODs or you solicit feedback from people when it comes to Rainbow Six? And how much harder is it to also be diving into the deep ends of the game and its meta, while also trying to shift your casting, as you said, to include more play-by-play, to do more hype stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because a lot of my studying of my own casting, for me now, also has to involve more studying of other people's casting than I maybe did before. For example, when I was in Overwatch, because I had so many hours in the game before I started casting it, I didn't necessarily have to study other casters to see what sort of color information or analysis they were doing. I would look at other casters to see what they were doing stylistically and how I could improve my style and my delivery. Whereas in Siege, what I've done is I've simultaneously looked at my casting and my delivery, looked at the points that I'm making, and when I look at other casters, I look at both of those things as well. So it's kind of twofold. I've kind of doubled up what it is that I have to do in my homework, I suppose. But it's an interesting one because, you know, learning the game to a higher level and more depth also gives you more context in when to get hype and how much to get hype. And so for me, learning how to be hype in the first place has to come hand in hand with those things. And I think I've managed it kind of well. Obviously, I still have a lot of improvement to do, but that was kind of intimidating at the start because I was like, oh man, I've got to learn how to cast in a way I'm not used to casting, as well as getting better at understanding this game anyway from an intuitive perspective. Kind of daunting. But for me, what I often do now is like, I'll watch back a VOD, I'll watch my casting. I will primarily be looking to see if what I say is correct, or if on rewatch, if the points I'm making are the points that me as a watcher of my VOD would also make. So if I'm thinking like, oh, this is happening, I hope I mentioned that. If that is what I mentioned in the cast, great, I'm happy with that. And then also, obviously, just listening, because with things like hype parts or even just certain deliveries on certain parts where you're trying to build up your co-caster, for example, you know, I sit there and I'm like, okay, does this sound to me as a spectator how it sounded to me in my head when I was doing it? And trying to figure out those bits and how I can implement that going into my future cast. So there's a lot of stuff all going on that I've kind of tried to juggle when going back and reviewing my casting and studying my casting and stuff, but I think it's gone okay.
Yeah, you were thrown into the deep end. You had rotating duos for a period of time. You were doing analysis work on the desk. You were jumping in as a caster, shouldering both some of the weight when it comes to color commentary and play-by-play. So we're very lucky to have you in the scene, but you weren't always a caster. You studied theoretical physics prior to getting here. How do you even make that jump from theoretical physics to esports commentary?
Well, so for a long time I wanted to work in video games. Pretty much as soon as I went to university, I decided I wanted to work in video games. I went through a period of maybe wanting to do development, but I realized I hated working with computers, and I also didn't enjoy it, and I didn't get coding, so that one went out the window pretty quickly. I'd always done stuff on camera, like I'd done YouTube for a really long time, and when I sort of put two and two together, that I could combine the two things, like my love of like being on camera and my love of video games, I was like, oh my god, that really works. And I get a lot of people say, you know, how did you go from theoretical physics to video games? I never planned to work in physics. I literally did a physics degree because I thought it was interesting. I really enjoyed it. I didn't even do it for its employability. I honestly just thought it would be interesting. So it was never gonna be my career plan. I was always looking for something else. I had this whole plan in my head that I was gonna go into video games and then I was gonna go into politics later on down the line. Never once did physics come into it. So maybe the less interesting answer, but it was always going to be video games.
I think there's I don't think you can say it's uninteresting or people can be disinterested when it's the truth, but appreciate you coming on the show, appreciate the interview, appreciate the work that you do in the EU League, and good luck in Stage 2 when it comes back. Thank you very much for joining us, Gio.